Today we're going to have a conversation about a topic that all strength coaches, sport performance coaches, and sport coaches should be interested in discussing. Whether that is listening to this today or starting the conversation with other coaches in your area, it is crucial to the development and success of your athletes. What if I were to tell you that there was a relatively simple way to reduce injury risk at the beginning of a sports season? I think most athletes and coaches would be on board. Let's be honest, few things are simple, but there are ways to reduce risk of injury that are often ignored. Now, if you are an athlete or coach, think about some of the common injuries you see in your sport. In track and field, for example, most common injuries are shin splints, hamstring injuries, and Achilles tendon issues. Baseball and softball typically see injuries to the shoulder and elbow, knee injuries, ankle sprains, and hamstring strains. Volleyball tends to see ankle sprains, knee injuries, patellar tendonitis, and stress fractures. Basketball might see ankle sprains, knee injuries, shin splints, and foot injuries. And in tennis, we see a host of injuries to the shoulder and elbow, wrist, knee, and lower back. Can they be prevented? Some of them possibly, but the truth is injuries happen. Not all injuries can be prevented, but the risk can be reduced. We know now, as evidenced with research, that a well-designed strength and conditioning program can increase strength in muscles, tendons, and ligaments. Every now and then you'll see an injury that seems unbelievable and you'll wonder if it could have been prevented. I currently have an athlete who plays volleyball. She's strong and powerful, but in a match this past season, she lunged for a ball, went up on her toe, and her ankle twisted completely around, damaging a tendon along with two ligaments. It looked awful, and to hear her describe it, it was definitely painful. Now, could it have been prevented? Possibly, I suppose, but the awkward position she found herself in and the torque she put on her ankle made it seem improbable that the injury could have been completely prevented. Now, we could go down a rabbit hole of, if she had moved a certain way instead of lunging backward, it wouldn't have happened. If the pass was better, she wouldn't have been in that position. But those are all hypothetical. They are sort of freak accidents that no one can anticipate, and they aren't 100% avoidable. Now, those injuries I'm talking about, those aren't the injuries I'm talking about. The injuries I am talking about are injuries that happen simply because the athlete isn't prepared, or simply because of mismanaged workloads. At the beginning of most seasons, sport coaches do their best to get their athletes in shape. It can be tough preparing for a season because unless there's a specific strength and conditioning program to follow at the school or the athletes are training in a private sector, some athletes might not be at the level physically that they should be in order to begin the season at a high level. If you heard my interview with Nate Van Callenberg, you heard us talk about the importance of a well-designed strength training program, but part of that conversation was recognizing that not all schools are able to have a qualified strength and conditioning coach on staff. Coaches are also restricted to a number of certain contact hours and can only supervise team activities at specific times during the year. Now, this is why some coaches might feel the need to cram a few weeks leading up to the season, but just like waiting the night before a test to study, cramming physical preparation doesn't always turn out the way that you would like. Every athlete wants to be prepared for the beginning of the season, but it needs to be done progressively. When training and workload increases too quickly, the risk of injury also increases. If not immediately, it could set up the potential for injuries later in the season. Now, early research on workload and injuries was focused on basketball, rugby, and baseball pitchers. In these studies, workload progression was most commonly measured with the acute-chronic workload ratio. Now, what is the acute-chronic workload ratio? In simple terms, it is the amount of training or work performed recently compared to the amount of training or work performed over a longer period of time. For example, An acute workload might be the amount of training or practice an athlete does in the first week of practice or the week prior to the first game of the season. The chronic workload would then be the amount of training or practice the athlete does over a longer period of time leading up to that point. So you can think of the chronic workload as what the athlete did during the off season, and the acute workload as what the athlete does in the first week of practice. If the athlete has a higher chronic workload, he or she will be able to, or will be better prepared for the season and will be at a lower risk of suffering an injury. If the athlete doesn't train or practice the entire off season and all of a sudden their workload is ramped up in the first week of practice, that athlete is going to be at a much higher risk of injury. To help explain this, we can look at the workload injury model. Now, athletes enter a sport or activity with a certain risk profile. This includes previous injury history and other factors like aerobic capacity, strength, and power. Those factors can change over time and over the course of a season, but other factors like sex, age, and anthropometrics cannot be changed. If you aren't familiar with anthropometry or anthropometrics, it describes someone's body in terms of size, shape, and abilities. Now, Lee Boyce and Melody Schoenfeld do a great job of discussing this in their book, Strength Training for All Body Types, where they break down how people move and exercise differently based on their body. For example, someone with longer legs and shorter arms are going to have different challenges than someone, say, who has shorter arms and shorter legs and longer arms, I should say. But back to the original discussion, according to the workload injury model, the greater the exposure to workload, the higher the overall potential will be for an injury. Athletes can experience positive adaptations and lower their injury risk, which might help explain why chronic workloads are associated with a reduced risk of injury. It also states that workloads that increase fatigue and negatively modify an athlete's risk factors may increase future injury risk, just like chronic workloads are associated with a reduced risk of injury. Rapid spikes or acute or sudden changes in workload can increase injury risk. So we know that in order to progress, we need to disrupt homeostasis, right? We need to disrupt or challenge the state our body is currently in order to create adaptations. When we allow for adaptation, that is when we get stronger, increase capacity, and become more resilient. The challenge comes in balancing that stress we are putting on our bodies with a proper amount of recovery. If we don't allow for enough recovery, we won't continue to adapt. When we get the appropriate combination of stress and recovery, we can adapt and improve. On the other hand, when training volume, intensity, and frequency are not balanced, that's when we start to see symptoms of overtraining syndrome and possible injury. This reminds me of a tennis player I was working with about 8 years ago. After a long run in the state tournament, she took time off. Now, a lot of high-level junior tennis players don't take enough rest time, so I was glad to see her voluntarily take some extra time off. That was good. The problem came when she took too much time off. It was at the end of her junior year, and she was really focused on her schoolwork, filling out college applications and writing essays. And she enjoyed the time off so much that it extended into the spring. Before she knew it, it was summer, and she really wanted to get ready for a high-level summer tournament. As you probably suspect, she had to play catch-up, and she crammed with hours and hours of practice. Now, her practice time wasn't more than what she would usually do, practicing during your heavy competition season. But because she took so much time off and didn't ease back into it, she was doing too much and she ended up getting bursitis. The tournament she worked so hard to practice for and prepare for never happened, and she had to withdraw. Now, that's okay. Things happen, and it certainly wasn't the first time that someone had to withdraw from a tennis tournament. Where it impacted her most was her senior high school season. She did, however, still qualify for state again for her 4th consecutive year, but she struggled to hit overhead. So she had to, modify her playing style, and we actually joked that it might have helped her in the end because she was forced to serve underhand, and it completely threw off her opponents. A study published in 2020 in the European Journal of Sports Science examined the association and predictive ability of internal workload on risk of injury in high-performance junior tennis players. Now, this study included 15 high-level tennis players and investigated acute workload and chronic workload for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and 4 weeks. During the season, a total of 40 injuries were recorded, and they were associated with the acute workload. Now, in full disclosure, though, the study did say that high acute workload was only one of the many factors that associated with injury, and there were other aspects that were involved. A separate study published in the Journal of Athletic Training studied injury data from 15 NCAA sports over a span of 16 years. The study began in the 1988-89 seasons and concluded in the spring of 2004. It included game and practice injuries that required medical attention and resulted in at least 1 day of missed practice or a game. The results showed that injury rates were statistically higher in games compared to practice. But an interesting statistic was that preseason practice injury rates were significantly higher than both in-season and postseason practice rates. Preseason practice injuries were recorded at a rate of 6.63 injuries per 1,000 athlete exposures. This was an increase from 2.33 injuries per 1,000 athlete exposures for in-season practices. The reasoning for the difference was that adaptation had occurred by the time the season began, accounting for lower injury rates. In other words, their bodies adapted to the workload, and after that initial attack of injuries, the overall injury rate during the season was lower. So this brings us back to the idea that adaptation needs to occur in order to make progress, but if the workload is increased too quickly, you're going to be more likely to suffer an injury. To this point, we've talked about athletes not training during the season, or at least at a reduced intensity, and then suffering injuries when their practice or training is ramped up too fast. The athletes didn't have time to adapt in those cases and weren't getting enough recovery time. What about the other end of the spectrum? Instead of being relatively inactive during their season, there's another group of athletes who get no rest, or at least very little rest. An overwhelming number of youth athletes play at some level year-round. Now, I'm not talking necessarily about multi-sport athletes who are exposed to different movement patterns in their different sports and are competing in a healthy way, but more the idea of getting too little rest from the repetitive movements. This isn't bashing single sport athletes by any means. I think a lot of them are very successful and healthy from doing something they enjoy, as opposed to feeling like they're forced to play sports they don't like. If the athlete has multiple coaches, which I agree is also a good thing, but it's good to learn from a variety of experts. If there are multiple coaches, communication becomes crucial in helping those athletes manage their workloads so they aren't overstressed physically or mentally. The key is to know your athletes, understand their workloads, and program their training or practices accordingly. Ask questions of your athletes. Get to know your athletes outside of their sport or their training environment you always see them in. If they sound stressed or visibly look tired or like they aren't getting enough recovery, give them an active recovery day. Missing 1 day or changing the original plan for a day isn't going to break them. They aren't going to be unsuccessful because they didn't stay on the exact plan that you laid out ahead of time. Actually, they might get better in the long run. Think about it this way. I'm sure a lot of you have seen cases, and I know I have, where your plans are completely thrown off. An athlete has a big meet or game coming up, but their stress levels are super high, and you give them a rest day. And then they actually follow it up with the best performance of their season. Recovery is so important. Whether we are strength coaches, individual skill coaches or sport coaches, we have one priority, and that is working for the best interest of the athlete. Sometimes that means communicating with the other coaches, breaking out of your old habits as a coach to see what is really going to work for the individual athlete, and make sure their training or practice is progressive and not so aggressive when it comes to increasing the intensity that they end up getting injured. This sounds cliche at times, but the saying still holds true. The best ability is availability. If you are not familiar with the acute-chronic workload ratio or the workload injury model before today, I encourage you to find additional resources to help your athletes be their best and to stay relatively injury-free. Dig into the research where you can. We have a full library of research you can look into at journals.humankinetics.com. Also look into NSCA's Essential of Sports Science, Essentials of Strength Training and Conditioning. High Performance Training for Sports is an excellent resource. Scientific Foundations and Practical Applications of Periodization, and also Developing the Athlete. There's so many more to consider. You can also find more information from some of the best trainers, coaches, and sports scientists in the world on the Human Kinetics YouTube channel, and our podcasts, which are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Podbean, and the Human Kinetics website. So thanks for spending a little bit of your time with me today. Hope you learned a little bit from this, or at least encourage the conversation to talk to other coaches. Keep that communication going, keep the best interests of your athletes in mind, and help keep them injury-free. Until next time, train smart and avoid those preventable injuries so you can compete on game day.